The Alpha Course has become a phenomenon in indoctrinating people into the assorted Christian belief systems, no matter what particular deviancy those that present the course may follow. On investigation, I have found 10 of these courses available within a 10-minute drive of my house, and 4 within a 10-minute walk, representing Evangelical, Baptist, Anglican, non-denominational and United Reformed churches. The course serves 2 main purposes that lead to its success in religious society. The first is that it provides people with a sense of community and love that many seek, and most would agree that this is or can be a good thing, without considering the negative influences. After all, when people group together, things get done, and being part of such a group that wants to expand everyone into feeling the same is political gold amongst those that get to control it, as we have already seen in the evangelical parts of the USA. Secondly, the church that uses these techniques will then have new members to expand its own power within its own Christian version. It is a brainwashing technique that is brilliant in its ability to pull the wool over the eyes of its unsuspecting participants, and I doubt that hardly anyone would even notice, which includes the helpers of the course itself, that give up time and food for something which underneath is an age-old scam and a marketing technique. The term brainwashing would be laughed at by those that go on to worship an unseen, uncaring, invisible and non-existent deity that dwells outside of the boundaries of reality. Believing will make them willing participants that can be controlled through an ancient system of guilt, misguided world reality and outward judgment of others that do not share this nonsensical view. The main problem with the Alpha Course is that it sells nonsense disguised as reality and truth, and in the same way that homeopathy sells water as medicine, using the principle that if you sell bullshit, then at least a few roses will still benefit and grow. It gets into schools, youth and student groups, plus sports organisations, prisons, workplaces and even coffee shops. A few years ago it was difficult to find out what went on at an Alpha Course event, yet now it is possible through numerous blogs, videos available on YouTube and even downloads of courses themselves to ascertain just how it works and the methodology used without the need to go on one. Firstly, it is important to understand its success is credited to an old Etonian and Cambridge graduated ex-barrister, the Reverend Nicky Gumbel. During 1977, at a time when the Church of England had become seemingly in great decline, and the Reverend Charles Marnham of the Holy Trinity Brompton, a Church of England parish in London, devised the Alpha as a basic refresher course for church members, which was then used as an introductory course for those interested in Christianity. In 1990, the running of the course was handed over to the Reverend Nicky Gumbel, who has since grown the 10-week course, branded as a crash course in basic Christianity, that thrives today. By 2008, it was reported that 33,500 courses had been held in 163 countries by Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, British New Church Movement, Catholic and Orthodox churches. Over 15 million people had at this time attended courses worldwide, including 2.5 million in the UK. Today, organisers boast over 20 million students, with 200,000 people currently enrolled at 6,300 churches in Britain alone. Statistically, a significant minority of these people will leave the course as born again in the spirit of Jesus. Last September they spent £1.1 million or $1.66 million on advertising the course. It is reported that Alpha has 50 staff and a £10 million turnover per year, which is not bad for a free course and registered charity. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, is an Alpha Course graduate and supporter, and it is clear that Alpha is destined to play its role in the Anglican future, unless someone stands up and exposes it for the indoctrinating brainwashing that it is. Let's take a quick look at Nicky Gumbel talking about his background.
I came from a family of lawyers. I practiced as a barrister for 10 years myself. My son has just qualified as a barrister. My daughter's just qualified as a barrister. My sister is a barrister. My father was a barrister. My mother was a barrister. My grandfathers on both sides were barristers. My uncle was a barrister. If we'd had a cat, it would have been a barrister.
Barristers are specifically those that talk on behalf of a client in a court of law, pleading that client's case and giving expert legal advice, yet they differ from a solicitor that acts as an attorney in legal work. Barristers are often employed and act as representatives of the solicitor, who in turn act on the client's behalf. In effect, the barrister is often seen in the classic courtroom dramas, either in the role of defending a client or acting as the prosecution role for the state. I have sat on a couple of juries in my time and been enthralled by the theatrical exuberance of these characters. Good barristers, with the personality to hold the interest of an audience or jury, can and do sway opinions in their favour without any doubt. It is not a coincidence that great barristers demand high fees. It is not a matter of luck that those that win the most cases in a defence simply have by chance a constant stream of innocent clients. Being a barrister demands a high quality of knowledge and a capacity to speak with passion to an audience, but what it does not need is a sense of morality or even justice, yet both of these things must be perceived in the process. Courtrooms resemble churches in the sense of a captivated audience that is either forced to be silent or silent through courtesy to the speaker and to avoid social repercussions. The cases are often lengthy and can last several weeks, going over the same ground time and time again, yet often hinge on just a few facts amongst the constantly repeated conflictions represented by both sides. Fictitious courtroom dramas are presented over a short period of time and may be exciting to watch, but the reality of being a juror is often being subjected to many hours of boredom, whilst, in my experience, at least, sitting in the most uncomfortable wooden benches imaginable. I am unable by law to discuss a long case I sat on as a juror, yet when we gathered to discuss our verdict and we took an initial vote to declare our positions, 9 people decided that the accused was innocent and 3 voted guilty. I have to say at this point that I was one of the 3, and it took us about 5 hours to convince the other 9 to change to a guilty verdict. The evidence seemed fairly clear-cut to me, but the barrister had managed to play on the emotions using an absent and departed female family member as a cover story. I remember constantly saying to my fellow jurors, but there's no evidence for the story or any witnesses. Despite this, many had decided to vote with their gut instinct that this person seemed too nice to commit the crime. I also remember thinking that I could not trust the jury system, even if it was the best available. For those who think that I may have been wrong, or we may have been wrong, in our final judgment of a guilty verdict, we later learned that during sentencing of a long criminal history by this person, and later another case was unravelled involving a kidnapping of an absent family member that was ongoing at the time. The pressure of being in a minority at the moment of making a verdict can, and no doubt does, often sway those to a wrong decision. At one point I had to endure a full-blown argument with another juror, which almost came to blows. We did, however, shake hands at the end in order not to be biased against each other in our judgment and duty. In group decision tests, it often shows that if a majority of people who are in on how the test works deliberately go in the obviously wrong direction of decision making, despite evidence to the contrary, then the bemused person will often follow the crowd despite the fact that it must be clear to them that it is the wrong decision. These tests confirm that many will follow the crowd rather than the evidence. These facts are common knowledge to barristers and form a key basis to their case, whether the client is guilty or not. It is not the job of a barrister to judge, yet it is clearly his or her job to be expert in swaying the judgment in the client's favour. After centuries of these practices, it is not surprising that a barrister should have devised and been successful in manipulating the alpha course. Barristers will never give you a full picture, yet they will present the facts that favour their case, and even a few counter-arguments that they've already prepared answers for. It is up to the opposing barrister to point out the flaws in their arguments, or the parts that were not mentioned. This is not lying, even though the full facts are most likely known. It is, however, a way of gaining support and ultimate victory over their courtroom opponent. When no well-seasoned opponent is placed in a similar situation, the public are at the mercy of deliberate manipulation. So with this in mind, let's look at how the students of this course are often manipulated into this cult. I may be criticised for calling it a cult, as it's only an introductory course to a faith, yet it follows the patterns of a cult indoctrination to establish its goal. Firstly, it has been fortuitous in establishing itself within the Church of England, in one of the most affluent areas of London, with the backing of the rich and the famous, plus political and royal hierarchy. The Church of England and its Anglican badge is globally recognised as being the most liberal and free-thinking type of Christianity that is more likely to change policy to fit reason over ancient stupidity in unseen stone tablets. However, its ceremonial services have traditionally been less like watching paint dry and more like watching steel rust. To start with, it recognises why people go to church in the first place, and that is for social interaction with other locals in the area. So these groups use a well-known cult technique that is known as love bombing. In all reports from Alpha students, there is a mention of how nice people are and how they would go out of their way to make you feel at home. You would of course expect nothing else, even if you wore a Satan costume and carried a copy of the God Delusion. These people should not be ostracised for this, as it is what they seek themselves from others, in the same way that most people seek social grouping that is inherent within the altruistic genes of human evolution. This natural state of grouping causes dopamine production in the brain that acts as a natural reward system for our actions, making us feel good and loved. The trick of conversion to a state of feeling loved is fooling the brain into association with keywords like God or Jesus that can trigger your association with the social culture that the church provides. For all this to happen, the social gathering needs to be more like a party and less like a weekly chore. Indeed, the Alpha course provides food and social interaction before any type of preaching begins. The feeding process is important to relax its students and for common bonding and trust to be established before it starts. As with dinner parties, it seems rude to argue with your host, even if that host has a different opinion. Alpha advertises itself as embracing agnostics and atheists on its courses, and some reports show that those holding the course often enjoy interactions, as if it endorses it. The course follows a carefully worded script that has been devised by Gumbel to pull the wool over unsuspecting eyes of its audience. The key to its success can be found during the introduction at the beginning, where the evidence for the Bible's truth and the stories of Jesus are summed up in just a few sentences before moving on as if no discussion is needed.
But it's based on evidence, more like historical evidence, more like the kind of evidence in a legal case you might put before a jury. I spent 10 years studying law and practicing as a barrister, so for me personally, evidence is very important. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? The answer is that there's a great deal of evidence. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The first century Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, says this. He's talking about Pilate, Pontius Pilate, and he says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed.
That's right, Nicky. We need the type of evidence that would stand up in court, and as a barrister, that is exactly what we expect from a man with such an honest legal background. But wait, there seems to be some flaws in your argument that I will discuss here. Gumbel quotes Tacitus, the Roman historian who was born in 64 CE, or AD if you prefer. This was long after the reported death of Jesus, and as he did not even write these annals until around 109 AD, which makes him a 2nd century historian, not a 1st, and as such he would be writing on the hearsay of others and not as a contemporary. In fact, well into the known formation of the Christian cult and after the Gospel writings. He writes about the burning of Rome during 64 AD in the reign of Nero, blaming it upon people known as Christians who represented a vast multitude who were apparently then rounded up and crucified. It is, however, unlikely that there was a vast multitude of Christians in Rome at the time, or even Judea for that matter. Nero's persecution of Christians is not recorded by any historian of the day, and all this supposedly took place at the very time when Paul was supposed to be freely preaching in Rome, as written in Acts 28, verses 30 to 31. This persecution was most likely to have been included by a Christian imagination during the 5th century, and the 4th century Roman historian Eusebius was seemingly ignorant of this passage. So let's take a look at Suetonius, who was a Roman historian born around 69 AD and a contemporary of Tacitus, and as such was also bound by the same hearsay evidence. The passage in question refers to a Jewish group in Rome around 49 AD. It states that, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Christian apologists want to place the word Christus or Christ in as a misspelling, but it would have been after Jesus' death, and Chrestus was a common name at the time. Suetonius had no problem in mentioning Christians elsewhere as a new cult, without references to Jews, so why would this passage be taken as a proof for the existence of Jesus? Gumbel puts most of his evidence as that of Flavius Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, as he was the earliest historian to mention Jesus in his famous Antiquities in 93 AD, after the first Gospels were reportedly written. Once again, he was born too late to have had any first-hand contact with Jesus, and the texts that mention him are almost certainly added at a later date. Let's take a look at the evidence. The passage in question is, "Now there was at this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day. As the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." Well, most serious historians see this work of Josephus as a mixture of his own work and obvious Christian manipulation, which I will discuss here. Josephus was born about two years after the reported crucifixion, yet his father, Mattathias, would either have been a witness of Jesus' miracle performing life, or at the very least have the first-hand hearsay from those who were. Surprisingly, he wrote nothing of the life of Jesus, despite lengthy passages on other mundane characters at the time. Since Josephus was not a Christian but an Orthodox Jew, it is very unlikely he would have believed or written that Jesus was the Christ, or used the words, "if it be lawful to call him a man," which imply the Christian belief in Jesus' divinity. In the main, Josephus was an articulate, and many would say very boring writer. This passage is far more in the style of the Gospels, lacking detail and open to interpretation. You would have thought that a man who rose again after being crucified would have deserved a few more words. Although we do not have any existing early copies of this work, it is referenced by other early writers who, surprisingly, such in the case of Chrysostom, who died in 407 AD, and often referred to the work no mention was ever made of this passage. It is not mentioned by Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, circa 858 to 886 AD, even though he wrote several articles on Josephus, which indicates that this passage was not included in his copy. Other writers include Justin Martyr, 110 to 165 AD, Clement of Alexandria, 153 to 217 AD, or Origen, circa 185 to 254 AD. These men were extensive in quoting earlier authors, yet no referral was made of this passage. Origen even went further in his treatise against Celsus, Book 1, Chapter 47, where he states categorically that Josephus had no belief in Jesus. Since the 1800s, a vast majority of scholars have considered these passages in Josephus's works as fake and stayed silent over its relevance in the proof of an historical Jesus. Only in modern times have the apologist Christians seen fit to reanimate the argument as proof to back up the Gospels. Nicky Gumbel must be aware of this, and yet he includes it as fact in his course. The sad truth for Christians is that it's not what people later wrote about the life of Jesus, but the fact that not one person seemed to write about him at the time. It appears that not one historical character or philosophical record exists from the hand of anyone who met him or lived during his alleged time. According to the Gospels, Jesus was known across a vast area by a vast multitude and great priests. Countless times we hear about great multitudes that followed him and congregated to hear him speak. It is claimed that the Roman governor Pilate and Herod knew of him. Matthew 14, verse 1. If you read Matthew 4:25, it is claimed that there followed him a great multitude of people from Galilee and from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. In Luke 12, verse 1, we find that there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trod one upon another. The multitude of people thought of Jesus not only as a teacher and as a miracle healer, but a prophet. See Matthew 14, verse 5. There are many more instances of quotes like this, but let's look at Matthew 2 that describes Herod's concern over the infant Jesus, born in Bethlehem and had all the infants in that city killed. It seems unlikely that an infanticide of this scale would go unreported by anyone outside the Gospel writers. If we look at the works of Philo Judaeus, who lived between 20 BC and 50 AD and regarded as the greatest philosopher and historian of the time, we find a man that lived in Jerusalem during the alleged life of Jesus. Like a diary, he wrote in some detail of the Jewish events that occurred at that time and the surrounding area. Not one single mention was made of Jesus. The same can be said of other contemporaries such as Seneca or Pliny the Elder. The fact that not one account from any contemporary person on the planet mentions him during his supposed lifetime. You would have to agree this is quite extraordinary, and you will find few Christian apologists that would dare to mention or argue this embarrassing fact. So enough of finding proof outside of the Bible. Let's take a look at the Gospels.
But more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. Some say, well, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially, the more manuscripts we have, and the earlier they are, the less doubt there is about the original. So, let's compare other ancient texts. You'll see there in the manual various other historical texts. So, for example, you'll see Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy that we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap, we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130, and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 others. So, one of the greatest textual critics ever, F.J.A. Hort, said this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." And no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion.
Here we find Gumbel using the word science to describe textual criticism, which is indeed a difficult trade. It takes changes in things like ink and pens used in a document, plus the study of handwriting and spelling to date a document with some kind of accuracy. In the same way you can look at handwriting styles of the 19th century and easily determine them from the latter parts of the 20th. However, he then goes on to agree that no full Gospels exist before the middle of the 4th century, and even early scraps of the Gospels still fall well after the alleged death of Jesus. The fact that the New Testament is pretty much unchanged since the middle of the 4th century is entirely irrelevant to its sources in the 1st century. So when Mr. Gumbel says that at the end of the speech that no secularist would disagree with this, he is not lying, but he is planting a false truth that sounds like it means the opposite. An atheist, rather than his choice of words secular historian, would not disagree that the New Testament stands alone as a book that is relatively unchanged and high in numerical copies since about 350 AD. They will not even say that it does not stand alone in the same way that Sherlock Holmes novels do, but they would not say that having a group of cult-inspired fables compiled at least 300 years after the alleged and unproven events make it true. I could leave it there and let you, the jury, decide, but we should take a moment to look at these Gospels. The Gospels are generally credited to Jesus' followers that travelled with him, yet no one knows who actually wrote them, and none of them were written during his alleged lifetime. They are simply credited to unknown people called Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Add to this the very important fact that not one of these authors makes the claim to have even met Jesus during his alleged lifetime, and you will understand how difficult it is for us to consider them as truth. General consensus puts the earliest gospel that is attributed to Mark at some time after 70 AD, and the last attributed to John at about 90, anywhere to 120 AD. This would place the gospel writers at between 43 to 80 plus years after the account of the crucifixion. With perhaps no more than 2% of the population at that time expected to reach 70, then it's highly unlikely that these were eyewitnesses or they started writing in such an old age. The author of Luke shows himself as the interpreter of the Jesus story, and not an eyewitness, in Luke 1:1-4. The Gospel stories are not eyewitness accounts, and they come from unknown authors who repeated hearsay or invented parts, and not the characters themselves. They were almost entirely written in a third-person perspective, when eyewitnesses write in a first-person perspective, and even make claims of Jesus' statements when he was allegedly alone. They quote long speeches, yet never give an eyewitness or written source of how these words could have been confirmed after such a long time. At no point do they give a description of what Jesus looked like, which is unusual, as other historical characters are often described in detail. And for the Son of God, it would be a question many would obviously ask. As in a barrister's summary, I would like to point out that belief does not produce the historical facts that it needs to make a claim. No court of law will take its evidence on hearsay, and the lack of any real evidence would get it laughed out of the court long before a barrister would even get assigned to the client. Having many stories about Jesus is all very well, but without one eyewitness account, it is hard to take it seriously. Jesus may or may not have existed as a real historical character on which the stories are based, but all we really have is evidence for the belief of Jesus and the growth of a cult. The lack of evidence of an historical Jesus is even staggering to an atheist like myself, as even if the man himself could be found in history, then this would not mean that he was the Son of God or the miracles really happened without some sort of proof. With Nicky Gumbel's education credentials, it's highly likely that he already knows these faults in his argument, but it's highly unlikely that many people would turn up to a course pre-armed with the facts. Just in case they do, the course has an answer in its format. At the end of each talk, the students are split into groups that are often assigned a course helper to sit in on each group and guide for the discussion. These groups act a bit like a jury, with a jury leader assigned. Although this will give you a chance to view your concerns, it will also isolate your views from most of the students of the course. Remember that this occurs during the first introductory session, and the following weeks will move on to other subjects where the existence of Jesus will be taken as a concrete claim. There is obviously much more to cover in how this course plants the seeds of Christianity in the minds of the gullible, but the first step in the indoctrination is a key that is needed to open the door to emptying the minds of free thought and reason. Nicky Gumbel is clearly playing a game here, and in the words of the late Christopher Hitchens, if this man had an enema, you could bury him in a matchbox. As a final note, I would like to say that I do understand why people want to gather together and use this gathering as a force for good, or at least find a common purpose for a gathered community of friends. But this need not be at the expense of believing in supernatural nonsense that dictates what it considers respectable without reason or even truth. Many true things in the world are not as we would like them, but they are true nevertheless. Humanist groups are set up with this very thought in mind, and through reason and truth, the problems of the world would be much easier to heal. I clearly have to leave the rest of this course for another video, without covering even week 2, but the main lie will be planted on those who casually attend the first introduction day without most even being aware of it. Peace.